This one's on. Good. All right. Good morning, folks. I'd like to talk with you a little bit this morning about what we in HP see as the future of IoT, where we're coming from, where we're going to, with a particular emphasis on communication service providers, on telcos and their role in that. We have a kind of an interesting, fairly unique position within HP in that we deal a lot with the telcos, but also with enterprises. So we've got a fairly triangulated view of what enterprises are doing, what telcos are doing, and how it all fits together. If you look historically at IoT, just at 100,000 feet, historically it was data connectivity. The network didn't do much other than the connection. There was no knowledge in the network about the devices. There was no knowledge about the subscription, about the customer, et cetera. It was clearly an over-the-top type of play. If you look at where we're at today, we're starting to see more of that. We're seeing things like subscription and device management. There's knowledge in the network about what type of device is out there, what type of user is using it. But it's really just the tip of the iceberg. If you look at where it's going, we're going to see much more of a IoT enablement type of environment where we're getting data aware, where we're getting subscription aware. As the previous speaker mentioned, there's APIs and exposure up, so you can actually be a much richer experience. So that's from a functionality point of view. If you look at it from a cost point of view, I think it's equally important. Historically, the cost for IoT, when back in the days of connectivity only, was the same as voice. You took a SIM card that, in many cases, in the early days, you could take the SIM card out of a voice device and put it in a IoT or an M2M device and, back and forth, but essentially it was expensive. If you think of the ARPU in an IoT world, it's very, very low, 1/10 to 1/100th of what you got from voice. So having that high cost network for IoT was very, very limiting in terms of the volume of applications. Where we're getting to today is there's some improvement. We're seeing optimization, but it's still pretty much the same type of network that voice. There's some optimization, but it's 10, 20%, it's still predominantly expensive, and it's still very, very hard to get those billions of devices down to pennies. Where we think we're going, and we're reaching that tipping point, and we're starting to see real-world deployments today of day one overlay greenfield networks that are NFV, everything's virtualized, everything's software-defined networking, the previous speaker went through it, using the cloud, using the platform as a service. So we're reaching the point where you can actually get the cost significantly lower, and therefore we're starting to see some of these applications that you can get maybe $1 a month for are now becoming viable. So it's a very interesting tipping point that's occurring in the market in that costs are effectively dropping at the same time as value is going up. So you're starting to get more room, more oxygen in between, and more space. So we're reaching that point now that's quite exciting, and we're starting to see applications that wouldn't have been viable 3, 4, 5 years ago type of thing, wouldn't have worked, are now very, very viable. If you look at some of the experiences around the world where we in HP are playing in terms of this, just to give you an example of what some people are doing. And the interesting thing about this list is about half of them are direct enterprises doing their own IoT, and about half of them are through and with a telecom service provider. So you look at the top one is kind of interesting because it's here in Latin America, and it's not publicly announced, so I can't tell you the player, but it's a global telecom operator that is going to roll out a overlay network, day one NFV. So this is an enhanced packet core, a virtual EPC, the classical network, but instead of paying the 75 cents, $1 a sub type of thing to do mobility management and subscription management, HLR, HSS, all that networking stuff, they're doing it day one on common off-the-shelf servers, building an overlay network just for the connected car network. And the intention is to duplicate that in data centers around the world and literally have a cloud platform. And they can drive their cost, both their capital expenditure to build that network and their operating expenditure to run that network is about between 10 and 20% of what it would be for the classical network. You're looking at a project that we're doing in Italy, and this is through a CSP, where we've built for and with a CSP, and they're offering it back, and they're offering smart metering as a service to gas and water meters and electrical meters. So I won't go through the whole list, but you see very many around the world. There's a trend emerging, and there's really two parts of it. One, there are Large enterprises building their own, and when they build their own, they want to work on the devices at the bottom, and they want to work on the applications at the top. If you think connected car, they're very good at making cars, and they want to embed the applications, the client-server applications that the previous speaker spoke of. They want to build that into the car, and then they want the application back in the cloud that does the analytics and all that consumes all that data. You think of the various manufacturers out there. They don't want to deal with anything in the middle. They don't want to go build a huge network. They don't want to run a huge network. They want to consume it as a service. So every car that goes out, they don't want to be plugging SIM cards into the dashboard, etc. They just want to be able to say, okay, I sold another car, turn it on, it says hello world, self-registers, self-goes, they get a bill once per month, they don't think about it. And it's just part of that service. When somebody buys a new car, they say yes or no, do I want to have my car connected? And they pay X dollars a month as part of some subscription like streaming radio or whatever else. So these large enterprises are doing that, some themselves and some through the CSP. And thinking back to the previous picture, the real decision and the real opportunity for the CSP is how do they get the cost down, the agility up, how do they widen that divide and make sure that the network that they're building is high value. If it's just SIM cards, if it's just connectivity, it's not going to cut it. If you try and build it in side by side with today's voice network, it's not going to cut it. So you can read through them all, but it essentially, things like smart metering, things like lighting, smart cities, connected cars, but it's the tip of the iceberg. We're seeing more and more large players going in and building networks, totally virtualized day one, totally SDN ready, totally cloud, totally as a service. And to be perfectly candid, it's probably going to be about 3 nines. It's not going to be the 6 or 7 nines of the voice network. Think of the early days of voice over IP, the early days of wireless, the joke in the US, can you hear me now? That type of thing. If your meter sends out its 100 bytes of data and it has to try 4 times, or it takes a day to get there, not a big deal. So they're willing to go down on reliability, go down on latency, and with the view that in time it will be better, faster, stronger. So it's a lot like the early days of any evolutionary, any game-changing technology, but they're building these overlay networks just for IoT, and there's a different specification. The variability of the applications is huge. If you think of a meter that needs to send 20 bytes of data once a week, and it can be retried 5 times at one end of an SLA, all the way up to, there's a project in the subways in London where they're streaming video for security reasons and doing face recognition. And they want to be able to track people getting on and off of subways for recognition during those type of events. Think of the latency, think of the throughput, very wide range. So it's not just about plugging in a SIM and saying it's 3G or it's 4G or it's 5G. It's about, okay, what's the application? What are we actually doing? What type of data? What's the latency? All of those types of things. Some very interesting projects. If you net it out, as I mentioned earlier, we're at that tipping point and there's some really exciting things that are starting to happen, but there's also some really big challenges. And interestingly enough, I listed 8 projects on the previous slide. We're up to about 40 now around the world. If you look, it's the same thing. The same challenges, the same fundamental issues over and over. Scale is a huge issue. People want to start with sort of friendly type of trial. I talked about the car situation. We're working with a couple large auto manufacturers, and they say, fine, we can do a friends and family, we can do a couple 100 cars, but then when we're ready to go, we want to do millions. So think back to our voice days where, the rollout of a new phone, a new iPhone, a new Samsung, et cetera, the early days of that ramp, and how it can sometimes take years to get from 0 to tens of millions. These guys want to go 0, a trial of 100 on a device X, and then they want to go to hundreds of millions or billions in 12 months. And they want to be able to do that with 1,000 applications in parallel. The types of devices and sensors, et cetera, coming out, it scales on multiple axes. The agility, the speed, the scale, and the cost I've really lumped together because the answer to that goes back to that cost axis on the initial picture. You need to build it with NFV in mind. You need to build it SDN ready. You need to build it as a service and consume so these enterprises don't have to think about it. I won't read through, but it needs to run on just common off-the-shelf technology, et cetera. There can't be anything proprietary. It needs to be cheap, it needs to be fast, it needs to be simple, and these application guys can do what the verticals can do what they're good at. They can focus on the application and focus on the device and just not think about it. The other thing that we're observing is go-to-market is complicated from a telco point of view. Some of them have good experience with enterprises, with large enterprises, but the majority around the world struggle. So how do they go and approach a car manufacturer? So one of the examples on the previous slide was a large electric company and gas, a multimeter type company, gas and electricity in Japan. So we went to the carrier. The interesting role that HP is finding in this triangle that I referred to is because we have, with our enterprise services and our IT side of HP, we have relationships with these enterprises, we have relationships with these telcos. So we're seeing an ecosystem of what I picture mentally as a triangle, but that where you go together and you go and talk to the utility company and say, look, you just focus on the meters, you just focus on the applications and the billing and the subscription and all that. Between ourselves and our telco partner here, we can figure out everything in between. We'll host it in a data center. You can consume it as a service. Hello world, the scenario I went through earlier. But that go-to-market part is very, very important for the telcos to be successful in this space. The fragmented ecosystem is huge. I was watching with interest the previous speaker's discussion around the billions of devices and the protocols all being different and intentionally not trying to standardize. We can't constrain them. People are going to be, I was talking with somebody on the way in this morning that talked about a baby monitor on, wearing it on pregnant ladies and putting a little monitor on and then sending the data. All these people are going to be creative about these devices, and the protocols that they speak to each other or back to the network are wide and varied. So that ecosystem is very interesting. So this platform that needs to get built in the middle needs to be able to deal with huge variations in complexity and size, et cetera. The ROI is very interesting. When you go and talk to these enterprises, they go, okay, I get the top and I get the bottom. I'm good at devices and I'm good at apps. I don't really want to think about that middle, but don't surprise me. Don't surprise me on cost. Don't surprise me on time. Don't surprise me at all. Just I want to consume it as a service, and if I hit a successful one, I want to be able to go to $1 billion. And don't tell me that the cost just went up when you're somewhere halfway up that curve. So don't surprise me. So the experience of those 8 projects that I put on the slide before, and the 20 to 30 more behind it, we're learning over time how to get that much, much more predictable. But it's a big challenge in the early days for a CSP to go out and look in the eye and say, yes, you can put 50 million cars on this around the world and it will work. And your price will be X on the curve. So that predictability of ROI. Security, it's huge. Many of you have read in the newspaper about the situation where somebody was able to hack an automobile while somebody was driving down a highway. Somebody was able to get in and actually take over control of the car. So think about the wide variety of protocols and complexity in all of those devices. That's an opportunity and a threat. Security is huge, and it's IT world type of security, it's internet world type of security, it's not classical telco security. So the CSPs are very, very good about closing down your device and device management and all of that type, but this is a whole new world. And there's a whole set of people out there that like to play dangerous games with this stuff, and you need to be very, very IT security on a massive scale ready. And then last but not least, I've mentioned standards, and again, the previous speaker talked about 1M to M and how that's evolving. We've been very, very active and continue to be, but it's still very much a work in progress. So the platform that I referred to, we've actually got up and running for the 8 that I showed, and we're up to, as I mentioned, about 40. But the neat thing is as much as possible, it's 1M to M compliant. That is a work in progress and evolving. But it's modular. So each of these building blocks can be run as a service in the HP cloud. It can be run as a service in a telco cloud on their premise, or it can be hybrid. And what we're seeing is hybrid is the large majority. The CSP will say to us, you know what, Dave, we've got device management and it's working fine. We've got provisioning or activation and it's working fine. But we don't have device management, or we don't have one of these blue boxes or another. So it's very rare that we go in and they say, we're starting fresh, just stand this up in the cloud and I'll consume it as a service. It's much more common where they say, I have 2 of these blocks, but I need these 2. And I want those 2 in the cloud, and I want these 2 on my premise, at least until I get to some level. So that hybrid variant is very, very important. And then if you're going to have a modular hybrid variant, obviously you need to standardize those interfaces. So it's an emerging, evolving thing, and we're doing a lot of work to try and feed that back into one M2M and the various standards bodies. The other neat thing about this that I think comes back to the theme about the future, if you take that and you can see the IoT gateway layer, and to the point of all these devices, where the world is actively encouraging the diversity. So there will not be a standard of those devices. They will not all talk one language. So having that gateway layer that just says anything to anything, so that aggregation and being able to pull in. But that MVNO connectivity in the middle, because many of these devices will talk to each other via 5G, there will be NFC, there will be Wi-Fi, et cetera. It won't all be classical telco type networks, and they'll switch back and forth. So that diversity of access, that diversity of gateway, et cetera, feeding into this modular. But the key thing to me is to be able to offer it at low cost, with NFV, with SDN, with cloud, as a service, predictable, and just allow the enterprises to focus on what they're good at, the bottom devices, the top applications, and just not think about the middle. With that, I'm out of time. Thank you very much.